Before his marriage to one of London's most admired young ladies, the Duke of Ashford made a decision that would quietly alter the course of his life forever. He did not confront his fiancée. He did not accuse her. He did not warn her. Instead, he vanished. To society, Alaric Hawthorne, Duke of Ashford, departed for France on urgent estate business. His carriage rolled through the iron gates at dawn, servants stood in neat rows, and his fiancée watched from the steps with a sorrowful smile as he disappeared down the long Yorkshire road. But the Duke never left Ashford Court. Hidden within the forgotten galleries of his ancestral estate, he remained behind watching, listening, waiting. Not to test his fiancée's affection for him, but to see how she treated his sick mother, when she believed no one was watching. What he witnessed behind closed doors froze him to the bone. And it was not the lady of rank who revealed the truth, but a quiet maid no one ever noticed. Ashford Court had stood for centuries, its grey stone walls bearing witness to loyalty and betrayal in equal measure. Dukes had been born beneath its roof. Wives had wept within its chambers. Power had passed from hand to hand as silently as the turning of the seasons. Now, within its hushed corridors, another truth waited to be uncovered. Alaric Hawthorne, Duke of Ashford, was a man schooled in discipline and restraint. Society praised him for his composure, his measured speech, and his devotion to duty. Yet beneath the calm exterior lived a mind sharpened by caution, for Alaric knew that in Victorian England, appearances were often the most dangerous deceivers of all. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Hawthorne, had once ruled London drawing rooms with effortless authority. Now illness confined her to a single chamber overlooking the South Gardens, her once strong hands trembling upon embroidered linen, her voice reduced to a fragile whisper. And it was there beside that bed that Alaric's doubts first took root. Lady Cordelia Winthrop, his intended bride, performed devotion flawlessly before others. Her voice softened, her eyes glistened, and her gloved hand rested delicately upon the old woman's fingers whenever servants were present. But when the door closed, when silence fell, something in the air changed. It was the Dowager Duchess who finally spoke the words Alaric could no longer dismiss. "Watch her when you are gone," his mother murmured one evening, her voice faint but unwavering. A woman's heart is revealed in how she treats the helpless. And so, on the morning his carriage was meant to carry him across the Channel, the Duke of Ashford chose deception over departure. He would hide within his own house. He would observe without interference. He would let the truth reveal itself. What he did not expect was that truth would have a name. Clara Whitby. A maid who knelt not because she was weak but because she was the strongest person in the house. The Duke of Ashford had perfected the art of departure long before he ever learned how to trust. From the tall windows of Ashford Court, the carriage rolling down the long gravel drive appeared final, its dark frame gleaming beneath the pale Yorkshire sun, its wheels cutting a steady rhythm into the morning air. Servants stood in solemn lines along the steps. Heads bowed. Doors opened and closed with trained precision. And at the top of the stone staircase stood Lady Cordelia Winthrop. She was dressed in pearl grey silk, the fabric falling elegantly along her figure, lace trimmed at her sleeves and throat. Her hands, gloved in soft kid leather, rested lightly at her waist. The expression upon her face was one of composed sorrow, tender, controlled, perfectly appropriate. "My dearest Alaric," she had said moments earlier, pressing her lips to his cheek. "Do not linger abroad longer than necessary. Ashford is dreadfully empty without you." Alaric Hawthorne smiled in response. It was the sort of smile society applauded, polite, restrained, entirely unremarkable. Only his mother had ever known when his smile did not reach his eyes. The carriage passed through the iron gates and vanished beyond the line of ancient oaks that marked the edge of the estate. Cordelia lingered, lifting her hand in a final gesture of farewell, as though fearful the world might accuse her of indifference if she turned away too soon. Then, with a measured breath, she straightened and stepped back inside. Within the old north gallery of Ashford Court, Alaric stood motionless behind a narrow opening concealed within the stone wall, watching her retreating figure from the shadows. He had not boarded the carriage. He had not left for France. Instead, he had stepped aside at the final moment, slipping into the forgotten arteries of his ancestral home corridors his late father had once used to observe guests unseen. The choice had not been born of suspicion alone. It had been born of a single sentence spoken the night before. "Watch how she treats me when you are gone." His mother's voice had been weak, but her eyes, still sharp despite illness, had never wavered. Margaret Hawthorne lay propped against embroidered pillows, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling slightly upon the coverlet. Age and sickness had thinned her frame, yet the authority of a duchess remained unmistakable in her gaze. Alaric had taken her hand then, pressing his lips gently to her knuckles. "You are overtired," he had said softly. "Cordelia has been attentive." A faint, knowing smile had touched his mother's lips. "Attentive when watched," she replied. "That is not the same as kind." Now, hidden within the stone bones of Ashford Court, Alaric watched as Cordelia crossed the marble entrance hall. Her posture remained impeccable. Her expression serene. But as the last servant disappeared into the eastern corridor, something shifted. Her shoulders relaxed. The curve of her mouth flattened. She exhaled sharp, impatient. "So," Cordelia said aloud, as though the house itself were her audience. "At last." Alaric's jaw tightened. She removed her gloves briskly, handing them to a passing footman without meeting his eyes. "Have luncheon served promptly today," she instructed. "I will not have delays." "Yes, my lady." Cordelia moved toward the corridor leading to the Dowager Duchess's chambers. Alaric followed silently through the parallel passage, his boots soundless against the worn stone. The air was cool, dust-laced, but he scarcely noticed. His attention was fixed entirely upon the woman he had intended to marry. Cordelia paused outside the sickroom door. When she entered, her voice softened instantly. "Good morning, Duchess," she said sweetly. "Did you rest well?" Alaric closed his eyes briefly. The transformation was flawless. From his concealed vantage, he watched as Cordelia seated herself beside the bed, her movements careful, her tone warm. She spoke of the weather, of household matters, of Alaric's supposed journey as though concern came naturally to her. But Margaret Hawthorne said little. When a maid entered to adjust the curtains, Cordelia smiled graciously. When the maid withdrew, the smile vanished at once. "You need not perform for me," Cordelia said quietly. "He is gone." Margaret's eyes sharpened. Alaric's breath caught. Cordelia rose and moved toward the window. "You have lived long enough to know," she continued coolly, "that illness becomes inconvenient when indulged." Alaric's hands clenched. A soft shuffle broke the tension. A young woman stood near the doorway, head slightly bowed, hands folded before her. "Clara," Cordelia snapped without turning. "Leave us." The maid hesitated only a heartbeat, but Alaric saw it. "Yes, my lady," Clara Whitby replied softly. She stepped out, closing the door behind her. Cordelia sighed in irritation. This house is always watching, she muttered. If only she knew. Alaric leaned closer to the narrow opening. The mask had not slipped. It had fallen. And he knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in his chest, that he had just saved himself from a lifetime of beautiful lies. Ashford Court had always possessed a voice of its own. It spoke in the low creak of floorboards that remembered centuries of footsteps, in the whisper of silk skirts passing through corridors, in the steady ticking of clocks that measured time not in minutes, but in generations. Even in its quietest hours, the house breathed alive with history, tradition, and watchful restraint. But on the morning after the Duke's supposed departure, that voice changed. The silence that settled over Ashford Court was not peaceful. It was hollow. Alaric Hawthorne felt it immediately as he moved through the concealed passageways of the Old North Gallery. The walls seemed closer than before, the air heavier, as though the estate itself sensed the absence it had been made to believe was real. He paused behind a narrow grate overlooking the eastern corridor and listened. No laughter. No gentle murmurs. No unnecessary footsteps. The household moved with an efficiency that bordered on fear. Below, servants passed with lowered heads, their voices hushed, their movements swift. It was not Alaric's presence they feared, for they believed him far across the channel, but the sudden authority that had filled the vacuum he left behind. Lady Cordelia Winthrop had taken command. She emerged from her chambers just after breakfast, her heels striking the marble floor with sharp, deliberate rhythm. She wore a dark plum gown, severe in cut, its elegance unmistakable but stripped of softness. Gone was the pearl-gray silk, the carefully arranged gentleness meant for public display. This Cordelia did not perform. She ruled. Mrs. Hale, Cordelia said briskly, stopping short before the housekeeper. The south drawing-room has not been aired properly. I will not receive visitors in a stale room. Yes, my lady, Mrs. Hale replied, stiff-backed and pale. And see that luncheon is served precisely at 1. No delays. His Grace disliked tardiness, and I will not allow standards to fall simply because he is away. Alaric's jaw tightened. She invoked his name not with affection but as a weapon. Cordelia continued down the corridor, her gaze coldly appraising every servant she passed. A young footman faltered, nearly dropping a tray as she swept by. Careful, she snapped. Clumsiness is unbecoming. The boy flushed crimson and bowed his head, murmuring an apology she did not acknowledge. Alaric followed. Through hidden arches and narrow stairwells, he tracked her progress as one might track an intruder. Each step she took stripped away another layer of illusion he had once accepted without question. At last, Cordelia stopped before the door to his mother's chambers. She did not knock. She entered. From his vantage point behind the wall, Alaric saw the room unfold through the narrow opening, the tall windows draped in pale muslin, the faint scent of lavender, the familiar shape of his mother resting against a mound of pillows. Margaret Hawthorne turned her head slowly. "Good morning, Lady Cordelia," she said, her voice faint but composed. Cordelia inclined her head, not quite a bow. "Duchess." No warmth. No softness. Only formality. Alaric's fingers curled into his palm. Cordelia approached the bedside, her steps measured, her eyes sharp. She looked not at Margaret's face, but at the table beside the bed, the tray of untouched tea, the neatly arranged medicine. "You have not eaten," Cordelia observed. Margaret met her gaze steadily. I was waiting. For what? For kindness, Margaret replied quietly. Cordelia's lips pressed into a thin line. You will eat when it is brought, she said coolly. Illness does not excuse disruption. Alaric's breath caught. His mother said nothing. She had lived long enough to understand when silence carried more dignity than protest. Cordelia turned away, scanning the room with visible irritation. This chamber is too warm, she continued. You will grow sluggish if indulged. She crossed to the window and flung it open without warning. Cold Yorkshire air rushed in, stirring the curtains. Margaret shivered. Alaric surged forward a step before stopping himself, his teeth clenched so tightly his jaw ached. Then soft footsteps. A presence at the doorway. Clara Whitby stood just inside the threshold, a folded shawl draped over her arm. Her hair was neatly pinned, her posture respectful, her gaze lowered. My lady, Clara said gently, the wind. I did not summon you, Cordelia snapped without turning. Clara hesitated only a moment. Forgive me. I thought the Duchess might. Leave, Cordelia ordered. Margaret shifted slightly. The maid may stay. Cordelia turned slowly, her expression sharpening. I beg your pardon? I said, Margaret repeated calmly, the maid may stay. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Alaric's heart pounded. Cordelia's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to Margaret. Something dark and calculating passed through her expression. Very well, she said at last. But do not mistake allowance for necessity. She stepped aside. Clara crossed the room quietly, moving to Margaret's side with practiced gentleness. She placed the shawl carefully around the Duchess's shoulders, tucking it just so. Margaret sighed softly. Thank you, child. Clara smiled faintly. Of course, Your Grace. Cordelia watched them with narrowed eyes. You may go, she said sharply to Clara. Clara straightened. If the Duchess has need. She does not, Cordelia cut in. I will attend to her. Alaric saw the way Clara's fingers tightened briefly at her sides. But she obeyed. Yes, my lady. As Clara turned to leave, her eyes lifted briefly not to Cordelia, but to Margaret. Something unspoken passed between them. Reassurance. Promise. Then she was gone. Cordelia waited until the door closed. The silence that followed was thick oppressive. Your son indulges you, Cordelia said suddenly, her voice low. He mistakes habit for devotion. Margaret's gaze remained steady. My son mistakes nothing. Cordelia scoffed. You have lived long, Duchess. But do not imagine your influence extends indefinitely. Alaric felt something cold and sharp lodge itself in his chest. Cordelia stepped closer to the bedside, lowering her voice. Ashford Court will not be ruled by frailty, she said. Nor will I allow sentiment to weaken what must be strong. Margaret studied her calmly. Strength without mercy is not strength at all. Cordelia laughed softly, a sound devoid of warmth. How poetic. She reached for the medicine tray. Then, with a careless flick of her wrist, she knocked it to the floor. The porcelain shattered. Pills scattered across the stone. Margaret flinched. Alaric's vision went red. That will not be necessary today, Cordelia said coolly. Rest will suffice. She turned on her heel and strode from the room. The door shut with finality. For several long moments, Margaret remained motionless, her gaze fixed on the scattered pills. Her shoulders sagged not in defeat, but in quiet exhaustion. Then the door creaked open again. Clara slipped inside. She took in the scene in a single glance. Without a word, she knelt. The cold stone met her knees as she reached for the scattered medicine, gathering each tablet carefully, wiping them clean with the edge of her apron. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Child," she whispered, "you need not." "Yes, I must," Clara replied softly. Alaric watched from the shadows as Clara worked patiently, reverently, as though each pill were precious. And in that moment, standing unseen within his own walls, the Duke of Ashford understood something with startling clarity. The house had fallen silent. But truth had begun to speak. By the third day of the Duke's absence, Ashford Court had learned to move quietly. Servants spoke only when necessary. Doors closed softly. Even the great-grandfather clock in the East Hall seemed to tick more cautiously, as though aware that sound itself had become dangerous. From within the concealed corridors, Alaric Hawthorne watched it all with growing clarity. Power, he had learned, did not announce itself with raised voices or grand gestures. True power revealed itself in how others adjusted their breath around it. And Lady Cordelia Winthrop now controlled the air of the house. She sat at the head of the breakfast table that morning, porcelain cup lifted delicately to her lips, her posture flawless. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the pale gold threads woven through her gown. To an outsider, she would have appeared every inch the future Duchess of Ashford, composed, refined, unassailable. Yet Alaric, observing through the narrow grate above the gallery stairs, saw what others could not. The impatience in her eyes. The irritation when a spoon clinked too loudly. The way her gaze flicked coldly across the servants as though weighing their usefulness. "This tea is weak," Cordelia said, setting her cup down with deliberate force. "Have it remade." "Yes, my lady," the footman replied at once. "And inform Mrs. Hale that I will review the household accounts this afternoon," Cordelia continued. "I will not tolerate inefficiency." Alaric's lips pressed into a thin line. She was not waiting to become mistress of Ashford Court. She was already behaving as though she were. When breakfast concluded, Cordelia rose without a word of dismissal. Servants scattered instantly, moving to clear the table with quiet urgency. She did not look back. Alaric followed her. She ascended the main staircase, her skirts brushing the banister, her expression set with purpose. There was no hesitation in her stride this time, no pretense of concern. She knew exactly where she was going. The Dowager Duchess's chambers. Alaric reached the parallel passage seconds before her, his pulse steady but his thoughts racing. Each visit Cordelia made to his mother chipped away another layer of restraint. He told himself to remain still. To watch. To endure. Cordelia entered without knocking once again. Margaret Hawthorne lay propped against her pillows, her face paler than the day before, her breath shallow. The open window from the previous morning had left the room cold despite the fire burning low in the grate. "You look no better," Cordelia remarked, her tone cool. Margaret turned her head slightly. Illness rarely improves under scrutiny. Cordelia ignored the remark. "You have not taken your morning medicine." Margaret's gaze shifted briefly to the empty tray. It was misplaced. Cordelia's mouth curved faintly, not a smile, but something close. "How unfortunate." She crossed the room slowly, her steps measured, predatory. "You know," Cordelia said, "when Alaric and I are married, things will change." Alaric felt a chill run through him. Margaret did not respond. Cordelia continued, her voice lowering. "Ashford Court requires energy. Vision. A future. Not lingering." Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around the blanket. "This house has endured many futures." "Yes," Cordelia agreed lightly. "But it has also discarded what no longer served it." The words landed like a blade. Alaric's chest tightened painfully. Cordelia leaned closer, her perfume sharp in the air. "You should be grateful," she added. "Most women of your age are sent away quietly. I intend to ensure your comfort." Margaret met her gaze fully then. "And where," she asked calmly, "do you intend to send me?" Cordelia straightened. "That," she said, "will depend on how agreeable you choose to be." Silence stretched between them. Margaret's eyes were steady. "You mistake obedience for dignity." Cordelia's expression hardened. "I mistake nothing," she snapped. "You are a burden." The word echoed in the quiet room. Alaric's hands clenched so tightly his nails bit into his skin. Cordelia turned away abruptly, her gaze landing on the small table by the bed, the water glass, the folded napkin, the medicine Clara had carefully restored. She picked up the tray. And then, with calculated contempt, she tipped it. The glass shattered. The pills scattered. Water soaked into the rug. Margaret gasped softly, not in pain, but in shock. Cordelia looked down at the mess, her eyes cold. "You will not need these today," she said. "Rest is sufficient." She turned to leave. The door opened before she reached it. Clara Whitby stood there, frozen. For a moment, none of them moved. Cordelia's eyes narrowed. "Were you listening?" "No, my lady," Clara replied quietly. "I came to check on the Duchess." Cordelia's gaze flicked to the shattered glass, the pills on the floor. "Clean it," she ordered sharply. "Then leave." Clara hesitated, her eyes moving to Margaret. "Do it," Cordelia snapped. Clara knelt at once, her movements swift but careful. She gathered the pills, her fingers trembling only slightly. She wiped the water from the floor with her apron, lifting the broken glass piece by piece. Margaret watched her with glistening eyes. Cordelia lingered, arms crossed, observing as though watching a task well beneath her attention. When Clara finished, she rose slowly. "May I assist the Duchess with her medicine?" Clara asked softly. Cordelia laughed. "No," she said. "You may remember your place." Clara swallowed. "My place," she said carefully, "is to care for her." The words were quiet. But they carried weight. Cordelia's eyes flashed. "How dare you speak to me that way?" "I meant no disrespect," Clara replied, though she did not lower her gaze. "But she requires her medicine." Cordelia stepped forward. In one swift motion, she struck Clara across the face. The sound cracked through the room. Margaret cried out. Clara staggered, her cheek instantly reddening, her lip splitting slightly where her teeth cut skin. For a heartbeat, she did not move. Alaric surged forward in the passage, his breath ragged, his vision narrowing. It took every ounce of restraint he possessed not to tear the wall apart. "You forget yourself," Cordelia hissed. "You are nothing here." Clara lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were bright with pain but not fear. "I am here," she said quietly, "because someone must be." Cordelia stared at her, momentarily taken aback. Then she scoffed. "You will regret this." She turned and swept from the room, slamming the door behind her. Silence followed. Margaret trembled. Clara moved at once to her side, ignoring her own pain. She retrieved fresh water, gently helping the Duchess take what medicine remained unbroken. "I am sorry," Margaret whispered. "You should not endure this." Clara smiled faintly, though tears shone in her eyes. "I will endure," she said softly. "You should not be alone." From the shadows, Alaric Hawthorne watched. And in that moment, something irrevocable shifted within him. The woman he had intended to marry had revealed her soul. And the maid he had scarcely noticed had revealed her strength. Ashford Court was no longer merely a house of stone and history. It had become a place of judgment. And Alaric knew with a certainty as cold as steel. Cordelia Winthrop would never be Duchess of Ashford. Long after Lady Cordelia Winthrop's footsteps had faded down the corridor, Ashford Court remained unnaturally still. The fire crackled softly in the hearth of the Dowager Duchess's chamber, but even that sound felt distant, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Clara Whitby knelt beside the bed, her movements careful and unhurried. She had fetched fresh water and a clean cloth, and now she pressed it gently against Margaret Hawthorne's trembling hands, warming them, grounding them. "I'm so sorry," Margaret murmured again, her voice thin with grief. "I never wished this upon you." Clara shook her head, her dark hair slipping loose from its pins. "Please don't say that, Your Grace. I would rather endure 1,000 slaps than leave you alone." Margaret closed her eyes, tears escaping freely now. From the hidden passage, Alaric Hawthorne leaned heavily against the stone wall. The rage still burned inside him, raw, violent, barely contained, but something else had begun to weave through it. Something quieter. Something far more unsettling. Shame. He had allowed this to happen. He had brought Cordelia into his mother's home. He had mistaken elegance for virtue. And Clara, this young woman with bruised skin and steady hands, had paid the price. Margaret reached out, her frail fingers closing around Clara's wrist. "You should leave this house," she whispered. "Before she hurts you again." Clara met her gaze gently. "I won't." The certainty in her voice was unshakable. "You don't owe me this," Margaret said. Clara smiled, small and sad. "I owe myself." She adjusted the pillows behind Margaret's back, lifting her with a strength that belied her slight frame. When Margaret winced, Clara immediately softened her grip, murmuring apologies, as though the pain were her own fault. Alaric watched it all. He had commanded men who would walk into fire at his word. He had faced threats, betrayals, and violence without flinching. Yet the sight of Clara kneeling beside his mother, bruised and bleeding and still gentle, struck him harder than any enemy ever had. She did not kneel because she was weak. She knelt because she chose to. Clara retrieved the remaining medicine from her pocket pills she had discreetly saved from the shattered tray and measured them carefully. She helped Margaret sip water slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice, as though each word were a balm. "There," she said softly when it was done. "That should help." Margaret studied her face, eyes tracing the red mark blooming across Clara's cheek. "My child," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Who taught you such kindness?" Clara hesitated. For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across her expression. "No one," she said at last. "I learned it by needing it." Margaret's fingers tightened around hers. "You are wasted here," she said quietly. Clara shook her head. "I am exactly where I need to be." From the shadows, Alaric closed his eyes. He saw the world he had built, his estate, his title, his lineage with painful clarity. For all its grandeur, it had failed in the most basic duty, to protect the innocent within its walls. And yet here was Clara, standing like a bulwark where he had faltered. When Margaret drifted into a light sleep, her breathing finally steady, Clara rose carefully. She gathered the broken porcelain, wiping each shard clean before wrapping them in cloth. She paused only once, pressing her hand briefly to her bruised cheek, steadying herself. Then she turned to leave. Alaric followed. She moved through the corridor toward the servants' stair, her steps light despite the weight she carried. When she reached the narrow doorway leading to the basement level, she paused, her shoulders sagging as though the strength she had displayed moments before had finally drained away. She leaned briefly against the wall. And then she cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just silent tears slipping down her cheeks as she covered her mouth with her hand, stifling the sound. Alaric felt something fracture inside him. He stepped closer to the opening in the wall, close enough now to hear her uneven breaths, to see the way her body trembled as she struggled to remain upright. She wiped her face quickly, straightening as though ashamed of the moment's weakness. She squared her shoulders and descended the stairs, disappearing from view. Alaric remained where he was long after. That night, Ashford Court slept fitfully. Cordelia retired early, satisfied, certain of her dominance. Servants retreated to their quarters with quiet dread. The great halls lay dark and echoing. But Alaric did not sleep. He sat alone in the old north gallery, the same place his father had once hidden to judge guests and allies alike. Moonlight filtered through the narrow slits in the stone, casting pale bars across the floor. For the first time in years, Alaric Hawthorne did not feel in control. He felt awakened. He thought of Clara's words. I learned kindness by needing it. What life had shaped her into this? What losses had carved such resilience into her bones? He realized, with startling clarity, that while Cordelia had demanded admiration, Clara had earned reverence. And reverence, once earned, could not be undone. The following morning brought no relief. Cordelia's cruelty sharpened with confidence. She dismissed 2 servants for imagined slights. She sent Margaret's breakfast back untouched, citing improper presentation. She summoned Clara repeatedly, finding fault with every task, her eyes gleaming with something dangerously close to satisfaction. And still Clara endured. She lowered her head. She answered calmly. She returned always to Margaret's side. Alaric watched every moment. By afternoon, his restraint had become a knife edge. He no longer questioned what must be done. He questioned only how long he could wait. That evening, as dusk settled over Ashford Court, Clara returned once more to the Dowager Duchess's room. She adjusted the blankets, lit a small lamp, and began to read aloud in a soft-voiced poetry Margaret had loved in her youth. Alaric listened from the shadows. The words were simple, familiar. Yet they carried warmth into a house grown cold. Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes closed. My son, she murmured suddenly. He chose poorly. Clara paused. He did not know. Margaret's lips curved in a sad smile. Then perhaps he will learn. Alaric stepped back into the darkness, heart pounding. Yes, mother, he thought. I am learning. And as Clara's voice continued to weave its quiet magic through the room, Alaric Hawthorne made a vow silent but unbreakable. No one would ever strike her again. No one would ever threaten her again. And Lady Cordelia Winthrop would soon learn that there are consequences far more devastating than disgrace. Some truths, once revealed, could not be unlearned. And some kneeling figures rose higher than any lady of rank ever could. The morning dawned grey and restless, clouds pressing low over the Yorkshire hills as though the sky itself weighed heavy upon Ashford Court. Alaric Hawthorne stood within the narrow confines of the Old North Gallery long before the household stirred. He had not slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image: Clara Whitby kneeling on cold stone, her cheek burning red beneath Cordelia's hand, her back straight despite the pain. He had watched wars of influence unfold in Parliament. He had watched men destroy one another with nothing but words and contracts. But he had never watched cruelty unfold so quietly. Below him, the estate came slowly to life. Fires were lit. Trays were prepared. Doors opened and shut with cautious restraint. Lady Cordelia Winthrop emerged late. She descended the staircase dressed in ivory silk this time, soft and luminous, her hair arranged with delicate precision. To any observer, she would have appeared the very image of grace, calm, composed, and untroubled. Alaric felt a bitter twist of irony. She had chosen white today. As though innocence could be worn. "Where is the maid?" Cordelia asked sharply the moment she reached the hall. Mrs. Hale stiffened. "Which maid, my lady?" "The one assigned to the Duchess," Cordelia replied. "The quiet one. Clara." Alaric's muscles tensed. "She is attending to her grace," Mrs. Hale answered carefully. Cordelia's lips curved into something thin and cold. "Fetch her." "Yes, my lady." Alaric followed the housekeeper through the hidden corridor, his pulse steady but heavy. He knew what was coming. Cordelia had tasted power and she was not finished. Clara was in Margaret Hawthorne's chamber when the summons arrived. She had just finished adjusting the pillows and was smoothing the blanket when Mrs. Hale entered, her face drawn. "Lady Cordelia wishes to see you," the housekeeper said quietly. Clara's shoulders stiffened. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret's eyes opened at once. "Why?" Mrs. Hale hesitated. She did not say. Margaret reached out, catching Clara's hand. "Do not go alone." Clara smiled gently. "I'll be all right." They both knew it was a lie. Clara followed Mrs. Hale down the corridor to the small withdrawing room near the eastern wing. Cordelia stood inside, her back to the window, sunlight haloing her figure. She turned slowly when Clara entered. "So," Cordelia said, folding her arms. "You've grown bold." Clara lowered her gaze. "I beg your pardon, my lady." "Do not insult me with false humility," Cordelia snapped. "You defied me yesterday." "I did my duty," Clara replied quietly. Cordelia laughed a brittle, mirthless sound. "Your duty is obedience." "My duty," Clara said carefully, "is to care for the Duchess." Cordelia stepped forward. "You forget who commands this house." Clara lifted her head then. "No," she said softly. "I do not." The air shifted. Cordelia's face darkened. You think because you've earned the old woman's affection that you have protection? She hissed. You are nothing. Before Clara could respond, Cordelia struck her again. Harder this time. The blow sent Clara stumbling back against the table, pain flashing white-hot through her skull. She tasted blood instantly. From the hidden passage, Alaric lunged forward, slamming his fist into the stone wall. The sound echoed dully, muffled, but his knuckles split under the force. It took everything in him not to tear through the panel and drag Cordelia away. But he stayed. He watched. Cordelia loomed over Clara, her breath sharp, her eyes blazing with fury. You will learn, she spat. This house will not protect you. Clara straightened slowly. Her cheek burned. Her vision swam. But she stood. You may strike me again, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. I will not stop caring for her. Cordelia recoiled as though slapped herself. For a heartbeat, fear flickered across her face, quick and sharp. Then it vanished. We will see how long your courage lasts, Cordelia said coldly. After the wedding, you will be dismissed. Penniless. Unprotected. She turned away dismissively. Get out of my sight. Clara bowed stiffly and left the room. She did not cry this time. Alaric followed her through the shadows as she moved toward the servants' stair, her steps slow, uneven. When she reached the narrow landing, her strength finally faltered. She sank onto the bottom step and pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Alaric's breath hitched painfully. She had endured too much. And still she endured. She wiped her face roughly and stood again, drawing in a steadying breath before returning to Margaret's chamber. The Duchess took one look at her and knew. My God, Margaret whispered, tears spilling freely. She struck you again. Clara knelt at once, taking Margaret's hands. Please don't distress yourself. Margaret's voice shook with fury. She is a monster. No, Clara said softly. She is afraid. Margaret stared at her. Clara smiled faintly. Cruelty often is. Margaret pulled her into an embrace as best she could, holding her close despite her frailty. Clara closed her eyes, her body trembling. From the shadows, Alaric Hawthorne reached his breaking point. He had seen enough. The test was over. The truth was undeniable. And kindness, true kindness, had been punished for daring to exist. That night, as Cordelia slept in silk and certainty, Alaric moved through Ashford Court with purpose. He unlocked hidden doors, retrieved documents, summoned memories his father had once taught him never to forget. This house had rules. And he was still its master. He stood alone in the Old North Gallery, blood dried on his knuckles, moonlight carving his face into sharp lines. She struck her again, he murmured into the silence. And for the first time since this vigil began, his voice carried no doubt. Only resolve. Lady Cordelia Winthrop believed herself powerful. She had mistaken patience for weakness. She had mistaken silence for surrender. And she had forgotten the oldest truth of Ashford Court. That no cruelty committed in its walls ever went unanswered. There are lessons that cannot be taught. They are not spoken, not written, not passed down in careful instruction. They are learned only in stillness, when pride is stripped away and a man is forced to look without blinking at what he has allowed. For Alaric Hawthorne, Duke of Ashford, those lessons came in silence. The house slept. Or rather, it pretended to. Ashford Court lay wrapped in darkness, its great halls reduced to shadows and echoes, its ancient portraits staring down from the walls with expressions that seemed almost accusing. Generations of Hawthorns had ruled from these rooms, men who prided themselves on strength, legacy, and control. Alaric stood alone beneath their painted gazes. He had always believed himself different. More careful. Less cruel. A man who governed with reason rather than impulse. And yet, beneath his roof, cruelty had flourished. Not because he encouraged it, but because he had failed to see it. He moved through the Old North Gallery with a measured pace, the secret corridors familiar beneath his hands. His father had once brought him here as a boy, lifting a panel to reveal the hidden passage beyond. Power, his father had said, is knowing when to watch and when to act. Alaric had remembered the first part. He had forgotten the second. He stopped near a narrow opening overlooking the south wing, the servants' quarters below. A single candle burned in one small room, its light flickering weakly against the stone. Clara's room. It was scarcely larger than a cupboard. A narrow bed. A washstand. A single chair with a shawl folded carefully over its back. Nothing more. Alaric felt something tighten in his chest. This was where she returned each night. This was where she bore her pain alone. He watched as Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her posture rigid, as though holding herself together by sheer force of will. She pressed a damp cloth to her cheek, wincing faintly. No tears. Not now. She removed a small object from beneath her pillow, a folded scrap of paper, creased and worn. She smoothed it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly, and read it in silence. Alaric leaned closer, straining to see. It was a child's handwriting. Crude. Uneven. He could not make out the words, but he did not need to. The way Clara held that paper told him everything. Loss. Responsibility. Love without protection. She folded it again and tucked it away, as though returning a piece of herself to its hiding place. Then she lay down, turning onto her side, her back to the door. Alaric stepped back into the shadows, his breath unsteady. He had chosen Cordelia because she fit. She fit the role. She fit society's expectations. She fit the image of a duchess. Clara did not fit anything. And yet she belonged. Belonged in the deepest, most honest sense of the word. He moved away quietly, ascending toward the upper levels where his mother slept. Margaret Hawthorn lay awake, staring at the faint glow of the hearth. She looked toward the door the moment he entered. "I wondered how long you would stay hidden," she said softly. Alaric crossed the room and knelt beside her bed, taking her hand. It felt smaller than he remembered. "I failed you," he said. Margaret's fingers tightened around his. "No," she replied. "You learned." Alaric closed his eyes. "At her expense." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "At your awakening." He looked at her, then truly looked. At the strength still burning quietly behind frail flesh. "She is brave," Margaret said gently. "Not because she endures pain, but because she chooses kindness when she could choose bitterness." Alaric swallowed. "She should never have had to." Margaret nodded. "No. She should not." Silence settled between them. Then Margaret spoke again. "Cordelia believes power is something taken," she said. "Clara has taught you that it is something earned." Alaric stood slowly. The resolve that settled over him was not explosive. It did not roar. It crystallized. He would not shout. He would not accuse. He would not act in haste. Cordelia Winthrop had constructed her world on appearances. So he would dismantle it in plain sight. When he returned to the shadows, it was no longer to observe. It was to prepare. He retrieved letters, household records, witnessed accounts his father had once insisted upon keeping. He made note of servants Cordelia had dismissed, of instructions she had altered, of authority she had assumed without right. By dawn, Alaric knew precisely what must be done. And more importantly how. The sun rose pale and cold over Ashford Court, spilling light across stone and grass alike. Cordelia descended to breakfast radiant and untroubled. She had no idea that the house no longer bent around her. She had no idea that silence had chosen its side. Nor that the Duke of Ashford had already returned long before she would hear his footsteps. He had been taught that nobility was inherited. Clara was teaching him it was chosen. The sound of carriage wheels upon gravel shattered the morning calm. It was not loud. It was not hurried. But it was unmistakable. At precisely 10:30, the iron gates of Ashford Court swung open, and a black carriage bearing the hawthorn crest rolled into the drive. Lady Cordelia Winthrop froze mid-step in the east drawing-room. Her hand tightened around the porcelain teacup she had been lifting, knuckles whitening beneath silk gloves. "That is not possible," she murmured. Only an hour earlier, she had received confirmation via a carefully worded letter she herself had intercepted that the Duke would not return for another fortnight. Everything had been calculated. Controlled. The cup rattled faintly against its saucer. Servants stopped where they stood. Mrs. Hale pressed a hand to her chest. The front doors opened. And Alaric Hawthorne, Duke of Ashford, stepped inside his own house. He was dressed in black, travel-worn but immaculate, his coat cut with restrained severity. His expression was calm, so calm it sent a ripple of unease through everyone who saw him. Cordelia recovered swiftly. She rose, arranging her features into relief and joy, and hurried forward. "Alaric," she exclaimed. "You're back so soon. We weren't expecting." He did not embrace her. He did not kiss her cheek. He did not even smile. "Some in the household," he said evenly, his gaze passing over her as though she were a stranger. Immediately. The words fell like iron. Cordelia's smile faltered. "My dear, surely this can wait." "Now," Alaric repeated. Mrs. Hale moved at once. Within minutes, Ashford Court gathered. Footmen lined the walls. Maid stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes lowered. The butler positioned himself near the door, pale and silent. Margaret Hawthorne was wheeled in last, wrapped in shawls, her gaze sharp despite her frailty. Clara stood beside her. Her cheek still bore the faint shadow of bruising. Cordelia noticed. And for the first time since her arrival at Ashford Court, uncertainty flickered across her face. Alaric moved to stand before them all. "This house," he began, his voice steady and resonant, "has served the Hawthorne family for centuries. It has sheltered strength and suffered cruelty. It has witnessed loyalty and endured betrayal." His eyes met Cordelia's. "Today," he continued, "it will witness truth." Cordelia laughed lightly, though the sound rang hollow. "Alaric, this is highly irregular. If something has upset you, we can speak privately." No, he said calmly. We will speak publicly. A hush fell. I entrusted this house to Lady Cordelia Winthrop during my absence, Alaric said. I believed her capable of compassion. He turned to the servants. Was that belief justified? No one spoke. Then Mrs. Hale stepped forward, her voice trembling. No, Your Grace. Cordelia spun toward her. You will hold your tongue. Enough, Alaric said sharply. Mrs. Hale swallowed. She dismissed staff without cause. She denied the Duchess warmth, comfort, and care. Alaric raised a hand gently. Thank you. He turned to another servant. Then another. Each testimony fell like a stone. Cold rooms. Harsh words. Unjust punishments. Finally, he looked at Clara. Clara Whitby, he said. She stiffened. Yes, Your Grace. Step forward. She did. You were struck, Alaric said plainly. Cordelia gasped. That is absurd. Silence, he commanded. Clara lifted her chin. Yes, Your Grace. Twice. Yes. Margaret's hand trembled on her shawl. Cordelia's composure cracked. She is exaggerating, Cordelia snapped. A servant's word against mine. Alaric turned to her slowly. Against yours, he asked quietly. Or against this house? He gestured. The walls have eyes, Lady Cordelia. The room went still. Alaric reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed document. This engagement, he said, holding it aloft, is dissolved. Cordelia staggered. You cannot. I can, Alaric said. And I have. He stepped closer. You mistook silence for ignorance. Patience for weakness. His voice lowered, deadly calm. You raised your hand against those under my protection. You will never bear the name Hawthorne. Cordelia's face drained of color. She opened her mouth then closed it. For the first time, words failed her. You will leave Ashford Court today, Alaric concluded. With what you brought. Nothing more. Guards stepped forward. Cordelia laughed suddenly sharp, hysterical. You will regret this. Alaric's gaze did not waver. No, he said. You will. She was escorted out. The doors closed behind her. The sound echoed like a verdict. Silence returned. Then Alaric turned to Clara. He bowed. Not deeply. Not theatrically. But unmistakably. This house, he said, owes you a debt. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Margaret smiled. Ashford Court exhaled. Justice had been spoken aloud. Maybe you're watching this thinking, that would never happen in real life. People like Cordelia always win. But here's the truth they don't want you to know, every Cordelia gets exposed eventually. Every Clara gets vindicated. Sometimes it takes longer than it should. Sometimes the walls take years to develop eyes. But truth? Truth doesn't stay buried forever. If you've been the Clara in someone's story, if you've knelt when you could have walked away, if you've chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier, if you've endured because someone needed you to you're not weak. You're a warrior. And your Alaric is coming. Hit subscribe if you needed to hear that today. Because we're not done with this story yet. And neither is yours. Ashford Court did not return to normal. It rearranged itself. The change was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the moment just after a storm has passed when the air feels different but the ground is still wet. Servants moved more freely. Voices carried a little farther down the corridors. Doors that had once closed quietly now opened without hesitation. Fear had left the house. Clara Whitby felt it most keenly. She awoke the morning after Lady Cordelia's departure expecting tension, expecting reprimand, expecting the sharp edge of uncertainty that had defined her life for so long. Instead, she woke to sunlight spilling across her small room, warm and golden, and to a knock on her door that did not fill her with dread. Mrs. Hale stood outside, her expression softer than Clara had ever seen it. "His Grace wishes to see you," she said. Clara's heart stumbled. "Have I done something wrong?" she asked instinctively. Mrs. Hale shook her head. "No, child. Quite the opposite." Clara followed her through the corridors, her steps measured, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Ashford Court felt unfamiliar now, less like a place she survived and more like a place that noticed her. They stopped outside the Duke's study. Mrs. Hale opened the door and stepped aside. Alaric Hawthorne stood by the window, his back to the room, the Yorkshire countryside spread out beyond the glass. He turned when Clara entered. For the first time, she was not standing before him as a silent figure in the background of his life. She was standing before him as herself. "Thank you for coming," he said. Clara dipped into a shallow curtsy. "Your Grace." He gestured toward a chair. "Please. Sit." She hesitated, then obeyed, perching on the edge as though unsure whether the furniture was meant for her use. Alaric studied her quietly. "You were never meant to endure what you did," he said at last. Clara lowered her gaze. "I only did what was necessary." "That," he replied, "is precisely the problem." She looked up, startled. "For too long," Alaric continued, "this house has depended on the endurance of others while remaining blind to their sacrifice." He moved to his desk and retrieved a folded document. "Your position here has changed." Clara's breath caught. "I understand if you wish to dismiss me." "I wish nothing of the sort," Alaric interrupted calmly. He placed the paper before her. "You will no longer serve as a maid." Her heart thudded painfully. "Then You will serve my mother," he said, "as her companion." Clara froze. "A companion?" she echoed. Margaret's voice came from the doorway. "That means you stay," the Dowager Duchess said warmly. "Not as help. As family." Tears sprang to Clara's eyes before she could stop them. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Alaric's gaze softened. "You already have." The days that followed felt unreal. Clara was moved from the servants' quarters into a small sunlit room near Margaret's chambers. She ate meals at a table instead of standing beside one. When she walked the halls, heads no longer bowed past her, they greeted her. But with each kindness came discomfort. She was not accustomed to being seen. And Alaric, always watching, always aware, noticed. They encountered one another often now. In the library. In the garden. In quiet corners of the house where words were unnecessary. He began to ask questions. Not interrogations. Genuine curiosity. "What do you read? What makes you laugh? What do you miss?" No one had ever asked her such things. She answered cautiously at first, then more freely. And something within her, part long dormant, began to stir. One evening, as they sat with Margaret by the fire, Alaric watched Clara laugh at something his mother had said. The sound was light, unguarded. It struck him with unexpected force. This was not admiration. This was not gratitude. It was something far more dangerous. Later that night, Margaret spoke what he had been trying not to name. "You are changing," she said gently. Alaric did not deny it. "Be careful," she added, smiling knowingly. "Kindness can undo a man faster than cruelty ever could." Alaric looked toward the corridor where Clara's footsteps had just faded. "I think," he said quietly, "I would like to be undone." And somewhere deep within Ashford Court, the walls listened and approved. But that night, alone in her new room, Clara could not sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, the candle burning low, and allowed herself what she had forbidden for years. She took out the letter. The paper was soft with age now, the creases worn thin from countless foldings and unfoldings. Clara smoothed it across her lap with trembling fingers. The handwriting was childish. Uneven. Each letter formed with painstaking care by fingers too small to hold a pen properly. "Dear Clara. Mama says you had to go work for the big house. I miss you. When you come home, will you bring me a flower? Any kind. I'm not picky. The cough is back, but don't worry. I'm being brave like you. Love. Rose." Clara's vision blurred. Rose had written this letter 3 weeks before she died. Clara had been 12 miles away, scrubbing floors in a manor house for wages that barely fed them both. She had sent every penny home. It had not been enough. When the fever came, there was no money for a doctor. When Rose's cough turned to blood, there was no medicine. When her sister took her last breath, Clara was not there. She arrived home to find Rose already buried in the churchyard, a simple wooden cross marking the place where the only person Clara had ever loved lay cold beneath Yorkshire soil. "I brought you a flower," Clara had whispered, kneeling in the mud, pressing a wilted daisy against the fresh earth. "I'm sorry it's late." She had been 17. She was 23 now. And every day since, she had carried the weight of what she could not save. That was why she endured Cordelia. That was why she shielded Margaret. That was why she knelt. Because if she could protect one dying woman, just one, perhaps Rose's death would mean something. Perhaps Clara's failure wouldn't be forever. A soft knock broke through her grief. Clara quickly folded the letter, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Come in." The door opened. Alaric stood there. He took one look at her, at the tears, the letter, the rawness she had never let him see, and his expression shifted into something Clara could not name. "I did not mean to intrude," he said quietly. "You're not," Clara whispered. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He did not sit. He did not presume. He simply stood there, waiting. "You asked me once," Clara said, her voice unsteady, "what I missed." Alaric nodded. "I miss my sister." The words fell like stones. Alaric's breath caught. "I didn't know you had." "I don't," Clara interrupted gently. "Not anymore." She told him everything then. About Rose's laughter that sounded like bells. About how Rose would braid flowers into Clara's hair and call her a queen. About the fever that came suddenly, violently. About the letter that arrived too late. About arriving home to a burial she hadn't been allowed to witness. About the guilt that had lived inside her ever since, a cold stone she carried in her chest. "I couldn't save her," Clara said, tears streaming freely now. "So I save everyone else instead." I thought her voice broke. "I thought if I could just be kind enough, endure enough, protect enough people, maybe it would matter. Maybe she wouldn't have died for nothing. Maybe I could finally be enough." Alaric crossed the room slowly. He knelt before her. Not as a duke. As a man who finally understood. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You did not fail your sister. I wasn't there." "You loved her," he said firmly, taking her hands in his. "And you have honored her every day since by refusing to let cruelty win. By choosing kindness when bitterness would have been easier. By protecting my mother the way you wish someone had protected Rose." Clara's shoulders shook. "She would be so proud of you," Alaric whispered. And Clara shattered. She wept, not delicately, not quietly, but with the force of 6 years of grief finally released. Alaric caught her, pulling her close, letting her soak his shirt with tears she had been too strong to cry. "I see you," he murmured into her hair. "I see all of you. The strength and the sorrow and the love you carry. And you are not broken. You are not too much. You are exactly enough." Clara clung to him, her fingers gripping his coat as though he were the only solid thing in a world that had tilted beneath her. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "I'm so tired of carrying this alone." "Then don't," Alaric said. "Let me carry it with you." They stayed like that for a long time, Clara crying years of unshed tears, Alaric holding her as though she were something precious he'd been searching for without knowing. When her tears finally slowed, Clara pulled back slightly, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. Alaric smiled, sad, tender, honest. "Because," he said, "you taught me what kindness looks like. And I would be a fool not to learn from the best teacher I've ever had." Clara laughed through her tears, a small, broken sound that somehow held hope. "Rose would have liked you," she said softly. "I wish I could have known her." "She was everything good," Clara whispered. "Everything I'm not." "No," Alaric said firmly. "She was everything you are. You carry her goodness in you. It's why you can't stop caring. It's why you couldn't walk away." Clara closed her eyes, fresh tears spilling. "I named her Rose because she was so small when she was born," Clara said. "Mama said she looked like a rosebud just beginning to open. She never got to bloom." "Then we'll plant roses for her," Alaric said. "In the garden. So she can bloom here. So she's always with you." Clara looked at him, stunned. "You would do that?" "Clara," he said, his voice soft but certain. "I would do anything for you." And for the first time since Rose died, Clara believed she might be allowed to live again. Not just survive. Live. If you're watching this with tears streaming down your face, I want you to know something. The person you couldn't save? They would want you to save yourself now. Clara spent 6 years punishing herself for a death she couldn't prevent. 6 years believing that if she just worked hard enough, cared enough, endured enough, maybe she could make up for it. But here's what grief doesn't tell you: you're not supposed to carry it alone. You're not supposed to bleed yourself dry proving you're worthy of love. You're not supposed to spend your whole life kneeling because you think standing isn't allowed. Someone sees you. Someone knows you're tired. And someone is about to tell you that you're allowed to rest. Hit subscribe if you needed Clara's story to give you permission to put down what you've been carrying. Because the next chapter? It's going to change everything. The morning after Clara's confession, Alaric received a letter. It arrived with the breakfast tray, sealed with red wax bearing the crest of his cousin, Lord Pemberton, a man whose opinion carried weight in Parliament and drawing-rooms alike. Alaric broke the seal. Alaric. Word has reached London of your broken engagement. While I understand Lady Cordelia's character has been questioned, I must caution you against any further recklessness. There are rumors unfounded. I pray that you intend to elevate a servant to Duchess. I write not as an adversary but as family. Such an action would destroy everything our name represents. Society will not forgive this. Your mother's condition is lamentable, but you must not allow sentiment to cloud judgment. The Hawthorne legacy demands a duchess of proper birth, proper breeding, proper standing. Reconsider. For all our sakes. Pemberton. Alaric set the letter aside without responding. He knew what was coming. Letters from relatives questioning his judgment. Whispers in London drawing-rooms. Invitations politely declined. The slow, suffocating pressure of society's disapproval. He accepted all of it. What unsettled him was not scandal. It was Clara. She had withdrawn since Cordelia's departure, not in fear, but in careful restraint, as though she sensed a boundary forming and was determined not to cross it. That restraint hurt more than rejection ever could. He found her in the lower garden just before dusk, kneeling beside the herb beds Margaret loved, her sleeves rolled, earth smudged faintly at her wrist. "You need not do that," he said gently. Clara looked up, startled. "I wanted to." She rose slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. Alaric stepped closer. "You've been avoiding me." Her hands stilled. "I am being careful." "With what?" "With you." Alaric's jaw tightened. "Then allow me to be clear." She met his gaze, eyes wary. "I have no intention of pretending nothing has changed," he said. "Nor of asking you to disappear back into silence so the world may feel comfortable." Her breath caught. "But neither will I speak words that trap you," he continued. "So I will ask instead." He held her gaze, unflinching. "If I were to ask you to stand beside me not as gratitude, not as charity, but as my wife, would you want that?" The garden went utterly still. Clara's first instinct was to step back. "You cannot," she whispered. "They would despise you." "I know. They would call you reckless." "I accept that." "They would say I trapped you." Alaric's voice softened. "Did I trap you?" Tears welled in her eyes. "No." "Then do not speak for them," he said quietly. "Speak for yourself." Clara closed her eyes. All her life, she had learned to endure, not to choose. She had learned to kneel, not to stand. She had learned to serve, not to be served. When she opened her eyes again, her voice shook but did not break. "I love you," she said. "But I will not be the thing that ruins you." Alaric reached for her hand, not urgently, not possessively, simply offering. "Then let me be ruined," he said, "by the only thing that has ever made me whole." Silence stretched between them. Clara looked at his hand. She thought of Rose. She thought of all the years she'd spent believing she didn't deserve kindness. She thought of Alaric kneeling before her, holding her while she cried, promising to carry her grief with her. And she thought, maybe I'm allowed to choose too. Clara placed her hand in his. Yes, she whispered. Alaric's eyes closed briefly, his breath shuddering with relief. Yes, he repeated, as though needing confirmation. Yes, Clara said, stronger now. I will marry you. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. Thank you, he murmured into her hair. Clara laughed through her tears. You're thanking me? Every day, he said. For the rest of my life. And in that moment, standing in the garden where roses would soon bloom for a girl who never got to see them, Clara Whitby chose to believe she was worthy of love. Not because she was perfect, but because she was seen. They came 3 days before the wedding. Not as friends. As judges. Lady Ashcroft arrived first, Margaret's oldest friend, a woman whose approval had once shaped society's opinion. She swept into Ashford Court with her daughters in tow, her expression carefully neutral, her gaze sharp as broken glass. Margaret, she said, kissing the dowager's cheek with practiced warmth. I came as soon as I heard. How kind, Margaret replied coolly. Lady Ashcroft's gaze slid to Clara, who stood quietly near the window, hands folded, posture perfect. And this must be my son's fiancée, Margaret said clearly. Clara. The room went still. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Lady Ashcroft's smile tightened, her eyes narrowing with something between pity and disdain. I see. Over tea, the interrogation began. Where's your family from, Miss Whitby? Yorkshire, my lady. How rustic. And your father's profession? He passed when I was young, my lady. He was a laborer. How unfortunate. Lady Ashcroft's tone suggested it was unfortunate in more ways than one. And your mother? Also passed. Any brothers? Sisters? Clara's hands tightened in her lap. A sister. She died 6 years ago. Tragic. The word was flat, perfunctory. And you came to Ashford as a maid, my lady. One of Lady Ashcroft's daughters, a girl barely 20 with elaborate ringlets, gasped softly and covered her mouth, eyes wide with scandalized delight. Lady Ashcroft set her teacup down with deliberate care. How extraordinary. Each question was a blade wrapped in silk, designed to expose, to diminish, to remind Clara of everything she was not. Clara answered with quiet dignity, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. But Alaric saw the way her shoulders drew inward. He saw the way she shrank under scrutiny. When Lady Ashcroft finally rose to leave, she kissed Margaret's cheek once more. You are braver than I, she murmured, loud enough for Clara to hear. Or more foolish. Time will tell which. The door closed behind her. Silence fell heavy and suffocating. Clara stood slowly, her face pale. I should go check on Clara, Alaric said. She stopped but didn't turn. They will never accept this, she said quietly. You heard her. I am a scandal waiting to destroy you. You are nothing of the sort. I am everything they said. Her voice broke. A laborer's daughter. A dead girl's sister. A maid. You are the woman I love. Clara turned then, tears streaming down her face. Love isn't enough, Alaric. Not against this. He crossed to her, gripping her shoulders gently. Then we will make it enough. How? She cried. How do you fight an entire world? By not caring what it thinks. But I care, Clara whispered. I care that they will mock you. That they will call you foolish. That they will say I trapped you, seduced you, manipulated you. Let them. She stared at him. Let them say whatever they wish, Alaric said fiercely. Their opinions do not govern my life. Their approval does not define my worth. And their acceptance is not required for my happiness. But your legacy. My legacy, he interrupted, will be that I chose love over approval. That I chose character over breeding. That I chose the woman who knelt beside my dying mother over the woman who struck her. Clara covered her face with her hands, sobbing. Alaric pulled her close. I know this is hard, he murmured. I know you're terrified. But Clara, look at me. She lifted her head. What if I'm not strong enough for this, she whispered. Alaric smiled, sad, fierce, certain. You knelt in front of cruelty and refused to break, he said. You endured violence and chose kindness. You carried 6 years of grief and still had room in your heart for my mother. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Clara closed her eyes, leaning into him. Don't let go of me, she whispered. Never, he promised. That night, Clara stood at her window, looking out over the gardens where she and Alaric had stood just days before. She thought of Rose. I'm being brave like you, the letter had said. Clara pressed her hand to the glass. I'm trying, Rose, she whispered. I'm so scared. But I'm trying. The moon hung low and silver in the sky. And somewhere, Clara chose to believe, her sister was watching. Proud. The morning of the wedding dawned soft and clear. Mist clung to the ground like a blessing, wrapping Ashford Court in quiet reverence. The old oak tree at the edge of the estate stood tall and ancient, its branches reaching toward a sky painted in shades of pearl and gold. It was not the grand ceremony society expected. There were no orchestras. No parade of titles. No glittering crowd of London's elite. Only those who mattered. Margaret Hawthorne sat in her wheeled chair beneath the oak, wrapped in soft shawls, her face lined with age and illness but radiant with joy. Mrs. Hale stood beside her, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. The household servants had gathered, their faces filled not with judgment but with genuine warmth. And standing beneath the oak, dressed in black with a sprig of rosemary pinned to his coat, was Alaric. He waited. Then the door to Ashford Court opened. Clara stepped out. She wore a simple white gown, unadorned save for delicate lace at the sleeves and throat. Her hair was pinned loosely, soft and natural, with a single sprig of rosemary tucked behind her ear. For remembrance. In her hands, she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers and roses. For Rose, she had told Alaric that morning. He had kissed her forehead. For Rose. As Clara walked toward him, her steps slow and measured, Alaric felt his breath catch. She was beautiful. Not in the polished, calculated way Cordelia had been beautiful, but in a way that was honest, unguarded, real. When she reached him, she looked up with tear-bright eyes. I'm here, she whispered. You're here, he echoed, smiling. The ceremony was brief. No grand speeches. No ostentatious vows. Just truth. When Alaric took Clara's hands, his voice did not waver. I choose you, he said. Not because society allows it, but because my soul requires it. You have taught me that nobility is not inherited, it is earned through kindness, courage, and love. And you, Clara Whitby, are the noblest person I have ever known. Clara's tears fell freely. I choose you, she whispered. Not because I deserve you, but because you've taught me I'm allowed to be chosen. You've shown me that love isn't something I have to earn through suffering, it's something I'm allowed to accept. And I accept you, Alaric. All of you. They kissed as husband and wife beneath a tree that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. Margaret wept openly. Mrs. Hale smiled through her tears. Even the footman who had once looked through Clara now stood witness and celebrated. When Alaric and Clara turned to face the small gathering, hand in hand, Margaret raised her voice. To love, she said, her voice thin but strong. And to those brave enough to choose it. To love, the gathering echoed. And Ashford Court, which had witnessed so much cruelty, finally bore witness to something pure. Some of you are watching this thinking, this is just a story. Real life doesn't work like this. And you're right. Real life is messier. Harder. The Cordelias don't always leave quietly. Society doesn't always soften. Some Claras never get their Alaric. But here's what's true. You are allowed to choose love even when the world says you're not worthy of it. You are allowed to stand even when you've spent your whole life kneeling. You are allowed to believe that maybe, just maybe, your story doesn't end with suffering. Clara chose to believe she deserved happiness. Not because she was perfect. Not because she'd earned it through pain. But because someone finally saw her and said, "You are enough." If you're the Clara in your story, if you're still waiting for permission to choose yourself, this is it. This is your permission. You are enough. Right now. Exactly as you are. Subscribe if you needed to hear that. Because the ending of this story? It's going to wreck you in the most beautiful way possible. 6 months later. Ashford Court had changed. Not in structure, but in spirit. Clara walked the halls no longer as a shadow, but as Duchess, and more importantly, as herself. She had not erased her past. She wore it openly. When visitors asked about her family, she spoke of Rose. My sister taught me that life is fragile, Clara would say, her voice steady and kind. So I choose not to waste mine on cruelty. Some of society remained cold. Invitations were declined. Certain drawing rooms closed their doors. But others slowly, reluctantly began to shift. Because Clara did something revolutionary. She was kind. To servants. To strangers. To the forgotten. She remembered names. She asked questions. She listened. And kindness, it turned out, was contagious. One afternoon, Alaric found her in the garden, on her knees in the soil, planting roses. For her, he asked gently, kneeling beside her. For her, Clara confirmed. So she's always here. He picked up a trowel, hands in the dirt, working alongside his wife. They planted in silence for a while, the sun warm on their backs. Do you ever regret it? Clara asked suddenly. Alaric looked at her. Marrying you? Losing them. Your cousin doesn't write anymore. Lady Ashcroft hasn't called. Half of London thinks you've lost your mind. Alaric smiled. I have lost nothing that matters, he said. And I have gained everything I need. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You are worth 1,000 Londons, Clara." She smiled through tears. They planted the last rose together, pressing the soil gently around its roots. Above them, in her window, Margaret watched and smiled. 3 years later. Margaret Hawthorne passed quietly in her sleep, Clara's hand in hers, Alaric's voice reading poetry aloud. Her last words were, "Thank you for showing him what love is." Clara wept. But she did not break. At Margaret's funeral, half of London attended not out of obligation, but out of respect. For the dowager who had chosen truth over tradition. For the Duke who had chosen love over legacy. For the Duchess who had proven that worth was not inherited. It was earned. As they stood beside Margaret's grave, Clara placed a single white rose on the casket. "She would have loved this," Alaric murmured. "She did," Clara said. "She told me so." In the distance, the gardens of Ashford Court bloomed with roses white and pink and red, each one planted in memory, in hope, in love. 5 years later. Clara stood in the nursery, holding her daughter Rose Margaret Hawthorne against her chest. The baby cooed softly, her tiny fingers wrapping around Clara's thumb. Alaric appeared in the doorway, his expression soft with wonder. "She has your eyes," he said. Clara smiled. "She has your stubbornness." He crossed the room, wrapping his arms around them both. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Enduring what came after?" Clara looked up at him. "Marrying you?" "Enduring the judgment. The whispers. The letters from relatives who still don't approve." She thought of the cold shoulders. The pointed silences. The society matrons who still turned away when she entered a room. Then she looked at her daughter. At her husband. At the life they had built from kindness and defiance. "No," she said. "I regret nothing." Alaric kissed her temple. "Neither do I." Little Rose yawned, her eyes drifting closed. Clara hummed softly a lullaby her mother had sung to her sister, all those years ago. And Ashford Court, listening as it always did, approved. 10 years later. The gardens of Ashford Court were famous now. People travelled from across England to see the roses, hundreds of them, climbing trellises and spilling over stone walls, filling the air with fragrance and beauty. The Duchess of Ashford had planted every single one. Rose Margaret Hawthorne, now 10 years old, knelt beside her mother in the soil, her hands dirty, her face serious with concentration. "Why do we plant so many, Mama?" Clara smiled. "Because every person who was kind to me deserves to be remembered." "Even the ones who weren't duchesses?" "Especially them." Rose considered this. "Will you plant one for me someday?" Clara's heart clenched. "You're not going anywhere," she said firmly. "I know," Rose said. "But when I'm very, very old and I die, will you plant a rose for me?" Clara pulled her daughter close. "The most beautiful one in the garden." "What color?" "What color do you want?" Rose thought carefully. "Pink. Like the sunrise." "Then pink it shall be." They worked in comfortable silence, the sun warm on their backs, the scent of roses thick in the air. Later, when Rose ran off to play with the gardener's children, Alaric found Clara still kneeling in the dirt. "You're going to plant yourself into this garden one day," he teased gently. Clara looked up, squinting against the sun. "Would that be so bad?" He knelt beside her. "No. It would be perfect. They sat together among the roses, hands entwined, watching their daughter laugh and run through the gardens that had once known only cold silence. "Do you remember," Clara said softly, "when I told you I wasn't strong enough? I remember telling you that you were. You were right." Alaric squeezed her hand. "We were both right." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me when I was invisible. For choosing me when the world said I wasn't enough. For teaching me that I'm allowed to be loved." Alaric turned to her, cupping her face gently. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were never invisible. You were the only thing I could see." They kissed, soft and unhurried, surrounded by roses that bloomed in memory and hope. And somewhere, Clara chose to believe, Rose was watching. Proud. 20 years later. Rose Margaret Hawthorne stood in the garden of Ashford Court, now 20 years old, holding her mother's hand. Clara's hair had gone silver at the temples. Lines creased the corners of her eyes, laugh lines, mostly. Her hands were still strong, still steady, still kind. "Tell me again," Rose said softly. "About Aunt Rose." Clara smiled. She had told this story 100 times. 1,000. And she would tell it 1,000 more. "Your Aunt Rose was the first Rose," Clara began. "She never got to see you. But I think she would have loved you fiercely." "Was she brave like you, Mama?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Braver." "Tell me what she was like." So Clara did. She told her daughter about a little girl who braided flowers into hair and called her sister a queen. About laughter that sounded like bells. About a letter written in crooked handwriting, asking for a flower any kind. "And I brought her one," Clara said, her voice breaking. "But I was too late." Rose squeezed her mother's hand. "You've been bringing her flowers ever since," she said softly. Clara nodded, tears spilling. "Every rose in this garden," she whispered. "Every single one. They're all for her." Rose looked around at the acres of blooms, hundreds, maybe thousands, filling every corner of the estate. "She must feel very loved," Rose said. Clara smiled through her tears. "I hope so." They stood together in silence, surrounded by beauty born from grief, love grown from loss. "Mama?" Rose said. "Yes, darling? When I grow up, I want to be like you. I want to choose kindness even when it's hard. I want to kneel for people when they need it. I want to be brave." Clara's heart broke and healed all at once. "Then you already are," she whispered. 30 years later. Clara Hawthorne, Duchess of Ashford, died peacefully at the age of 53, surrounded by roses and love. Alaric held her hand until the very end. "Thank you," he whispered as her breath slowed. "For choosing me. For teaching me. For showing me what love is." Clara smiled, small, tired, but radiant. "It was always you," she murmured. And then she was gone. At her funeral, hundreds gathered, not just nobility, but servants, tenants, villagers. People whose lives Clara had touched with nothing but kindness. Rose Margaret stood beside her father at the grave, her hand gripping his tightly. When the service ended and the crowd dispersed, Rose knelt in the dirt and planted a rose. Pink. Like the sunrise. "For you, Mama," she whispered. Alaric knelt beside his daughter, tears streaming down his face. She loved you more than anything, he said. I know, Rose replied. She told me every day. They stayed there a long time, father and daughter, kneeling in the soil that had held so much love, so much loss, so much life. When they finally stood, Alaric looked back at Ashford Court. The house that had witnessed cruelty had learned kindness. The walls that had hidden secrets had learned to speak truth. And the Duke who had married a maid had learned that real love was not about status or title or approval. It was about choosing. Every day. Over and over. Until the end. 50 years later. Rose Margaret Hawthorne, now 70 years old, stood in the gardens of Ashford Court with her own grandchildren, telling them the story she had been told as a child. Your great-great-grandmother, she said, was a maid who became a duchess. The children's eyes widened. How? Rose smiled. She knelt when she could have walked away. She chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier. She loved when the world told her she wasn't allowed. Was she brave? The bravest. Tell us more. So Rose did. She told them about a duke who hid in his own house to learn the truth. About a dowager who saw worth where others saw nothing. About a woman named Cordelia who learned that cruelty always fails. And about two sisters named Rose, one who died too young, and one who lived long enough to prove that love could bloom even from the hardest soil. The children listened, wide-eyed and silent. When the story ended, the smallest child asked, "Will you tell us again?" Rose smiled. Every time you ask. And somewhere, in the roses that bloomed eternal around Ashford Court, Clara Whitby, the maid who became a duchess, rested. Not because she was perfect, but because she was seen, and loved, and remembered. Forever. You are not too broken to be loved. You are not too scarred to be chosen. You are not too much or too little. You are exactly enough. Clara's story started in silence, but it ended in revolution. She taught us that kindness is rebellion. That kneeling is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. That love doesn't require permission, only courage. If this story wrecked you, if you're sitting there with tears streaming down your face because you needed to hear that maybe, just maybe, you're allowed to be happy too, then Clara's story did exactly what it was meant to do. It reminded you that your story isn't over yet. Subscribe. Because the next story might be the one that changes everything. And maybe, just maybe, it'll be yours. You are seen. You are worthy. You are enough. Now go plant your roses.